morning is about entrepreneurs and rent seeking. I want to try to start with the end, and that's profits. Now, profits often have a bad name in society because we think of profits as being something that are taken from a transaction that might have been left for consumers or given to workers. And sometimes that's true. But a lot of the time, profits are the reward to entrepreneurship, to creating new products, and the cost of making that product is less than people are willing to pay for it. So that's really the bottom line. So let's start with an equation, and it's a simple way of organizing this. Economists use the Greek letter P to stand for profit, and then in the equation you see P, which is the price of the output. F is what economists call the production function, which is we put together capital and labor and use it to produce the output. And the costs of the two inputs are interest, R, the interest rate, and wages, the cost of labor. So when you look at this, what you see is that profits are what's left over after we take our revenues and subtract our costs. Profits are just the excess of revenues over costs. Now, what does it tell you if there's something left in revenues after all the costs are taken out? It means that people are willing to pay more for this product than it costs to make it. I realize I'm making a big deal about this, but it's a really fundamental point. Profits are a sign that people are willing to pay more for something than it costs to make it. Well, that must mean that you're creating value. So the simple thing, if you just take one thing away from this lecture that I want you to remember, is that profits are a sign that value is being created in the economy. Profits are a sign that value is being created in the economy. And it's kind of miraculous. This new value was widely shared, has been created by an entrepreneur. Now, an entrepreneur is person who organizes or operates a business or businesses taking on financial risk to do so. I want to contrast that with what's called a political entrepreneur, or someone who is a rent seeker. Political entrepreneurs are rent seekers. Political entrepreneurs use government funds. They're not selling to consumers, they're selling to the government in the form of subsidies. Now, that reduces the risk to the political entrepreneur, but it hurts taxpayers. The question is it worth it? Is it worth the tax money that political entrepreneurs are receiving in the form of subsidies? Germany leads the world in solar power. Many, many roofs of private homes and businesses in Germany have solar panels on their roof. Many houses and businesses in Germany have solar panels on their roof. Now, should they have those? If I were a private citizen, I would only buy solar panels if it saves me more money than it costs. But Germany decided to subsidize solar panels. What that means is people are going to take solar panels just so they can get the subsidies without regard to whether or not it produces enough energy. Well, it turns out that the solar panels that Germany subsidized are only 12 to 15% efficient, and that's on a sunny day. And there aren't that many of those in Germany in the winter, which is when they actually need electric power. They don't do that much air conditioning, but in the winter, when it's cold, there's very little sunlight. The days are short, and it's often cloudy. Turns out Germany's a terrible place to have solar power. And in fact, in 2015, they decided to stop these subsidies. It turns out that they wasted billions of dollars on these subsidies. Now, I don't mean that this is a wrap on solar power. Solar power may be a good technology. The problem is that this was sold to the government by political entrepreneurs. It was not sold to consumers. It didn't face the profit test. So when economists say the profit test, they mean that more value is being created than is being used up in the costs of inputs. That's not true for solar power in Germany, and it turns out probably to have been a mistake. Solar power is now advanced enough that it might make sense if they were starting now, but they didn't. They started 15 years ago. All these houses and businesses in Germany now have on their roofs first or second generation solar panels that are just not very effective, but they were very expensive. Well, what about electric cars? Again, if electric cars had to pass the profit test, we could be pretty sure that they're creating value, but instead we heavily subsidize electric cars. Now, electric cars may be perfectly worthwhile. I don't know whether that's true or not. What I do know is that entrepreneurs are selling electric cars mostly to the government in the form of subsidies, not to consumers, because it produces value. Some people have mockingly called these coal-powered cars, because if you have to plug your car in, the electricity that you're using is being produced by plants that, in much of the United States, burn coal. Well, is that producing a value? We have no way of knowing, because electric cars don't have to face the profit test. So let's distinguish again. Up here on the left, I have the first generation iPod, and over here, solar panels. So an entrepreneur might make iPods, selling a product to consumers for full price, and if it turns out that the costs are less than that price, it means value is being created. If not, the producer of iPods, in this case Apple, would have gone out of business. So the profit test means that you only survive if you create value. But a rent seeker might make solar panels, in effect selling that product to the government just because of subsidies. So they lobby instead of producing new products. So what you need to remember is entrepreneurs hire engineers and they sell to consumers. Rent seekers hire lobbyists and they sell to the government. That's the big problem that we face in the United States, is that many people who would otherwise be entrepreneurs are seduced to sell to the government. That turns out to be more profitable. That doesn't mean their product is bad, but it means it doesn't face the profit test, and that should raise warning signs. So market entrepreneurs are those who build their business with private funds, using either their own money or funds from investors. Market entrepreneurs succeed by giving the public useful goods or services at a good price. Political entrepreneurs, on the other hand, lobby government officials. And which group do we think benefits society more? Well, let's look at two examples of entrepreneurs. The first is the Mankgear. Now, the Mankgear is a Saxon word for a trader, someone who buys at a low price and resells at a high price. And the roots of the English word, which actually form my name, Munger, are in that Saxon word, Mankgear. So a monger is someone who buys and then resells at a higher price. And there's a famous psalter from about 1050 AD, so almost 1,000 years ago, where the character of the Mankgear is quoted. And here's the quotation. Now, I have a hard time not reading this in a Monty Python voice, so I apologize in advance. I may break into Monty Python falsetto, but I'll do my best. So here's the Mankgear. And this is kind of like the Canterbury Tales, where the Mankgear is a character. We don't know his name, he just is a character. He's a feature of the landscape. I say that I am useful to the king and the alderman, to the rich and to all people. I ascend my ship with my merchandise, and I sail over the sea-like places, and I sell my things and buy dear things which are not produced in this land. And I bring them to you with great danger over the sea, and sometimes I suffer shipwreck. I died 3 times, I go better. Okay, it doesn't say that, but this is a really sad story that he's telling. I suffer shipwreck, I lose all my stuff, I have great danger, the loss scarcely escaping myself. Well, he probably is wearing a really nice suit, he's a little bit overweight. It's a little implausible that he's actually being punished this much, but it is dangerous. It's risky to be an entrepreneur. So the interlocutor says, what things do you bring to us? He gives a long list of things that he brings. Will you sell your things here as you brought them here? Now that's an interesting question, and it might have 2 meanings. One is, do you improve them in some way? No, he does not improve them at all. All he does is go get them and bring them here. But it also might be interpreted, do you raise the price? And the answer to that is hell yes. Yes, I raise the price. I get the highest price I can charge. Will you sell your things here as you brought them here? I will not, because then what would my labor benefit me? I will sell them dearer here than I bought them there, that I may get some profit to feed me, my wife, and children. There's always the children, isn't it? Always for my children. Well, maybe it is. The point is, under what circumstances does his activities pass the profit test? The only way he makes profits is that people are willing to pay more for the products that he brings after he pays his costs, the cost of transporting them, and the risk that he's undertaking to pursue this trade. If he still can produce profits, it means he's producing value for people. He's producing value for people because every transaction is at a price that they're voluntarily willing to pay. They must value it even more. A second story by Somerset Maugham. Has anybody read The Verger in high school? A few people have. Somerset Maugham wrote a short story, and the verger was a minor functionary in the Anglican, the Episcopal Church, but he was a dignified man, and basically the verger would take care of things that needed to be done in the church. He would light the candles when they need to be lit, and he would turn the candles off. He would blow the candles out when they were no longer needed. He would put things away. He would help the priests with his vestments. Well, one day, they got, the verger had been there for nearly 30 years, had been in this church for nearly 30 years. He had come when he was 17. And he had been kind of a lost child. He'd been living in the church and had been serving for 30 years. One day they got a new vicar, a new priest, and the new priest interviewed all of the people who worked in the church, and when he talked to the verger, it turns out the verger could not read or write. And the vicar was appalled. We can't have someone here. This is the new Anglican church. We can't have someone here who can't read or write. So he fired the verger. The verger is very upset. And he walks out, and he's disconsolate. His head is down, because that's what happens when you're sad. And then he thought, I need a cigarette. He didn't smoke very much, but he was sad, so he needed a cigarette. He looked up and down this busy street and didn't see any tobacconist, and thought, well, that's odd. Why isn't there a tobacconist here? So he borrowed a small amount of money and opened a tobacconist, and also sold chocolate and magazines in this small store. And it turned out he did a great business. Many people showed up and wanted to buy tobacco, chocolates, and magazines. Well, he soon made enough money to open another shop, and another shop, and another shop. Where did he open them? On streets that didn't have tobacconists. That's not very complicated. That's not a very big rule, but it was his rule of thumb. Here's my visual aid. His decision rule, his rule of thumb, was to look for a busy street that didn't have a tobacconist and then open one. Well, before long, he had 10 thriving tobacco shops. And he goes to the bank and he wants to deposit the money there. He had 100,000 pounds, which was a fortune, a gigantic fortune. And the banker says, you've amassed a very large amount of money. You probably should invest it. You shouldn't just put it in a bank account. Here's some information about the sort of account you might invest in. And the verger said, nope, I'm sorry, I can't read or write. And the banker says, really? That's miraculous. Without being able to read or write, you've amassed this great fortune. Just think where you could be if you can read and write. And the verger said, well, I know the answer to that. I would be the verger at St. Peter's, Neville Square. Which means that entrepreneurs don't have to be very smart. Maybe entrepreneurs just have to be lucky. He had a rule of thumb, which he pursued. What's smart is the profit test. What's smart is the system where you only make profits if you produce value. Dumb people can make a lot of profits if they create value, and that's very frustrating to people who think they're smart and know how to run things. Because it means that some entrepreneurs, some business people, some people in financial markets that got lucky, all of them have a lot of money, and smart people like, well, me, I'm just a professor. I always did well in class. I look in the mirror, I see a smart person. Don't you ever die, I think. But I don't make nearly as much money as entrepreneurs who create value. Is that fair? I think that's a difficult question philosophically. Is it an entitlement that we would defend? Yes. Profits are not deserved. Profits are entitled. It's a much weaker condition. We have a system where people who create value get to capture part of that value. If it's luck, that's fine. They're still creating value for the society, just like the verger. Now, one of the assignments for this week was Folsom's book about the robber barons. And the title of the book is a little tendentious. It's The Myth of the Robber Barons. But I think that goes a little too far. Some of the people that he called robber barons really were, because they were rent seekers. Others were profit seekers, and rather than robbing, they were actually producing value. So you probably remember from high school, the early 1800s, there was a great technological innovation, the steamship. John Fitch was the first one to come up with a working model of a steamship in 1787. He got a patent in 1790. And if you're interested, you can see a model of this from the video in the PowerPoint. But the first working steamboat was the Clermont, which was Robert Fulton's, and it operated on the Hudson River. Now, what's the difference between the first steamboat and the first commercially successful steamboat? The answer is profits. Robert Fulton was producing profits because people were willing to pay more for the service of going in his steamboat from Albany down to New York City. They were willing to pay more than it cost him to provide. And so there was regularly scheduled steamboat service. Now, Robert Fulton could have tried to make his steamboat faster and provided better service. He could have hired engineers. He did not. He hired lobbyists. Robert Fulton was a successful engineer. He was a successful market entrepreneur. But he converted to being a rent seeker because he thought, probably rightly, that if he could get a license or patent that said he had an exclusive right to provide these services, he would be able to make more money by keeping competitors out than he could by serving consumers. Rent seeking is about keeping competitors out. Profit seeking is about serving consumers. Robert Fulton decided that he would become a rent seeker. So he faced some competition from Thomas Gibbons and some others who provided steamship services from parts of New Jersey into New York City. And Fulton spent almost all of his time with lawyers and members of the New York legislature trying to prevent this. Now, Gibbons hired, in a stroke of luck, the young Cornelius Vanderbilt to run steamboats between Elizabeth, New Jersey and New York City. And they actually had a flag, almost like a pirate flag. It said, "New Jersey must be free." Well, for 2 months, Vanderbilt was such a good steamboat captain, and these steamboats were so much better than Robert Fulton's. They had invested in engineering. The technology was better. They were fast. So the New York had these little gunboats. They didn't want to fire on them, and they were too slow to stop them. So Vanderbilt, for months, was able to provide this service, almost like a pirate, except he was a pirate that was providing ferry services for customers and cargo into New York City. Finally, though, they were stopped, and this led to the famous Supreme Court case of Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. And the question in Gibbons versus Ogden was, the state of New York allowed to regulate interstate commerce? That is, boats coming from New Jersey into New York. Could New York have a requirement that the only one who was able to provide that service was Robert Fulton? They had a patent that said he was the only one who could provide steamboat services, but was that constitutional? Because the Constitution says that only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. Fortunately, in Gibbons versus Ogden, the US Supreme Court held that the state of New York could not do this, basically outlawing rent seeking. The miraculous thing about Gibbons versus Ogden is that so early in our nation's history, 1824, the Supreme Court outlawed rent-seeking. It prevented state governments from selling monopolies to rent-seekers. That meant that the only way you could earn profits was to do a better job of serving consumers. And as long as that's true, we can be much more sure that profits are actually a sign that you're creating value. Now, the problem is we have departed from that wisdom. So much of our industry now is financed not by consumer purchases, but rather by subsidies. So Vanderbilt went on to develop his own steamship company. He had to compete against other government subsidized companies, and the history of that is told at some length in the book. So let me remind you, the difference that I'm trying to make is profits or the excess of revenues from selling a product after costs are subtracted. If the exchange is voluntary, each person buying the product must think he or she is better off. Entrepreneurs then seek profits and are trying to create value. Rent-seeking is a competition for an artificial prize or a benefit that's created either by taking away money from taxpayers and using it as subsidies, or a restriction on competition that allows an artificial increase in price. Political entrepreneurs then seek rent, and it's quite possible that no value is being created. It's just a transfer. Well, I've talked a little bit about how markets decide. And I've said that political entrepreneurs seek money from the government. How does the government decide? In markets, we decide based on the profit test. What's the test for the state in a democracy? And the answer is the median voter. The median voter. Political power lies at the center of the distribution of preferences that's effectively enfranchised by the rules of the society. And that means that in a democracy, the median is where power lies. Let's suppose we have 5 people in our little town, and we have to decide how much road salt. Winter is coming. We have to decide what our road salt budget is going to be. Now, Mr. A doesn't drive at all, but he has nice azaleas. He doesn't want any salt. Mr. B would want to spend enough that you can use salt to clear the main road. Mr. C wants a little more salt. He would like to salt the side roads to make it easier to drive. Mr. D says, clear roads for all. I want a budget that will provide clear roads for all. So enough salt for everyone. And Mr. E actually would like to salt the sidewalks in people's gardens. He hates azaleas. So this is a pretty typical political problem. In politics, we have to decide on one thing, and that's the budget. And we have disagreement. So we need a rule that allows us to decide one thing when we disagree. That's what politics is. A rule that we all accept, the legitimacy of which we all accept, that will allow us to make one choice among many alternatives, and we all accept that as legitimate, even though most of us disagree, because at most one of us can have what we want when we disagree. So, if we think of this graphically, I have A, B, C, D, and E, each with their most preferred budget for salt. And the question is, what's going to happen? And the answer I've already given you. It's the median. The median is the middle. And the reason you can tell that that's going to work is, suppose not. Well, let's suppose we're going to choose the budget advocated by D, which is $12,000 for salt. Well, is a majority opposed to that? Yes. A, B, and C all like C better. So we would move in that direction. Let's suppose instead that we're at B, we're at 100. Well, C, D, and E would all prefer 10,000. So you can work this out on your own if you want, but it turns out that if this median preference is ever proposed, it will win, and no alternative can defeat it. So politics decides in the middle. Politics decides in the middle. So you're actually selling stuff to the median voter in the form of asking for tax subsidies. Now, an interesting thing about this is that it's almost completely impervious to changes at the margins, at the side. It doesn't change very much. It's very conservative in a sort of small c sense. We're going to stay there. Well, suppose we've now made it our decision for C. Suppose that Mr. E decides not only does he not like azaleas, ice itself is immoral. So he wants no ice. Ending ice as we know it is his platform. So he tells the other voters of these deep insights into icicular immorality. He wants 2.5 million. What happens? Nothing. Changes out at the margin don't affect politics at all. Changes out at the margin don't affect politics at all, and that's probably good, because it means that we're pretty unresponsive to fringes, to movements out on the fringes. However, where does innovation take place? By definition, innovation always takes place on the fringes. So politics is going to be bad at innovation. It's going to be really good at protecting traditions. Why would we think that this system is going to be good at picking the technologies that are going to help us solve problems of global warming? Why would the median voter be good at this? The fact is, we need the profit test. We need changes out on the margin because we're not smart enough to know which one works best. So, again, you can see C is still going to be the choice, even though E has moved from 20,000 out to 2.5 million, it has no effect. Large democracies are inherently, and in many ways intentionally, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, resistant to changes in the ideas of just a few individuals. And that can be a good thing, since a lot of towns have a crazy person like Mr. E. Entrepreneurs in seeking profits can sell to the margin. If you're selling to politicians, then you're selling something to the median voter. Steve Jobs famously said, "You can't ask customers what they want and then try to give it to them. By the time you get it built, they'll want something new." In the end, for something this complicated, he said 10 years later, it's really hard to design products by focus groups. A lot of times, people don't know what they want until you show it to them. Henry Ford, this may very well be apocryphal, but it's often attributed to Henry Ford. He said, if I'd asked customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Because until you've seen a car, you have a really hard time saying, you know what we need is a car. What you'd want is faster horses. Entrepreneurship takes place at the margin. Politics cannot possibly choose that because it chooses at the median. Now, we do make some choices politically, and here's the list of bodies of companies that were producing solar panels and living on subsidies that have gone bankrupt. So 2006 through 2010, a few went bankrupt. Just in 2011, quite a few went bankrupt. Here's the ones who went bankrupt in 2012. 2012, there was a giant wipeout. All of these had survived by selling to the government. All they were doing was getting subsidies. Many of them never produced any solar panels. And recently, just in the last 6 months, 2 more companies, Abengoa and SunEdison, each of whom had taken more than 10 billion with a B dollars in subsidies and had produced giant solar farms that didn't produce any value. They closed without ever being able to sell anything because they were selling to the median voter. The median voter said, I like solar power, but it didn't pass the profit test. They were not producing value. Most famously, Solyndra, which had been touted by the US administration as a success story, went belly up. Now, again, let me emphasize, I'm not saying that solar power is a bad thing, any more than steam power is a bad thing. Steamships are a great idea. The problem was rent seeking. I'm not saying solar power is a bad idea. The problem is rent seeking. We cannot make companies say, I'm going to define success by how many subsidies I can get. We have to find a way to make companies pass the profit test. The profit test means no subsidies. Profits are evidence that the value created by the product exceeds the cost to the society. There's less risk to the society. If you win, you win big as an entrepreneur, like the verger. And remember I said, doesn't mean because you're smart, doesn't mean you're a genius, maybe you're just lucky. But luck's enough to mean I've created enough value to make my customers better off. We're just passing the entitlement test, not the more stringent philosophical test of deserving the profits. 56% of Americans believe in actual living space aliens, according to surveys, which means that if we were to ask the median voter, space aliens exist. That's probably not a good basis for public policy. And to be fair, our defense policy is pretty insulated from politics for just this reason. Why would we want an energy policy that's made by people that believe in magic? They're no better at that than they are at defense policy. The median voter is just the person who happens to be in the middle. So the profit test asks, are people willing to pay a sufficient amount to cover the cost of production and distribution, with something left over for profits? So that means people are paying less than it's worth, so they must think that they're benefiting. Well, is that really a good thing? Let's take a step back for a minute and consider pet rock. And I have to say, some of y'all are laughing, the pet rock was a real thing, if that could be a real thing. As the name suggests, it was a rock and it was in a box. And I well remember receiving a pet rock for Christmas, and it was my favorite Christmas present. It had, if you can see it, it had air holes cut in the box, and it said pet rock in case you were confused. You open it up and inside was a rock. Now, a guy named Gary Dahl thought pets were too much work. So 1975, he bought a bunch of just ordinary gray stones from a builder's supply store. He printed up these cardboard boxes, and it came, the cool part was that it came with an instruction manual. And by February 1976, people had stopped buying them, but he sold 1.5 million of them. I think they were $6 or $7. They cost about 30 cents to make. So do I still want to defend this? Remember, I said he's creating value. Problem is, in economics, value is subjective. Objectively, this is not a very good product. People are wasting their money. Subjectively, though, I still remember being pretty excited about having a pet rock. I was briefly one of the cool kids, and I wasn't used to that. So this passed the profit test. It created value, but the value is subjective. It just means that people were willing to pay more than it cost. Was it a benefit to society? That's not the way economics works. Problem is, people are their own judges of their own values. If they think it's worth more to them, they'll buy it. And I think that's a drawback that makes many people worried about the profit test, because we don't trust people to make their own choices. My question is, who are you going to have instead? Because every flaw in consumers is worse in voters. That's our only two choices. You're saying consumers aren't smart enough to make this choice. Yeah, but voters are. They're the same people, and voters have even less of an incentive to be informed. Now, the fun part was the 32-page manual with the instructions. Sit and stay, the rock was very good at. Roll over, you'd have to give it a little help. And attack, you pick it up and throw it. But the instruction manual was hilarious, and that probably was the reason that this was a successful product. You're going to think I'm kidding, but I'm not. One of the things that Dahl had to face was lawsuits saying that it was not original, because many other people said that they had the idea for a pet rock also, but they didn't have the instruction manual. So the big difference was they didn't have the instruction manual. Without the instructions, the rock really wasn't worth anything. With the instructions, you could really get something done. 2001, they did try an update. You get added functionality with the USB. Yes, I'm making that up. But that one didn't sell very well. But connecting the USB cable to it was a pretty good choice. So maybe you're worried. Maybe you're worried about pet rocks. Maybe you're worried about the profit test. But the only other choice we have is politics. The only other choice we have is the median voter. Now, it's true the median voter did not buy a pet rock. The median voter might very well have thought that solar panels brought by space aliens were a good idea. But since people didn't buy them and those companies all went bankrupt, it turned out to be a bad choice. So we have two not very good choices. The median is where choices are made in politics. Margins are where we make choices in economics. So in economics, we say the marginal firm, the marginal consumer, you're just indifferent between buying and not buying. But it doesn't take many people who are willing to buy to make something worthwhile. And if you want an illustration of the margin, it's one of my favorite cartoons. Mom, would it be okay if I ate the last Pop-Tart? Go right ahead, Peter. I bought 2 more boxes at the store this morning. Well, he's got all the Pop-Tarts. So he's eating not only the last Pop-Tart, but all the ones that led up to it also. So he's not eating the marginal Pop-Tart, he's eating all of them. So the thing is, the marginal one, the last one, the next one that you're going to consume is what we're going to see in this course is where a lot of economics happens. A lot of economics happens at the margin. John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous economist, said, in economics, things happen at the margin. The majority is always wrong. Now, John Kenneth Galbraith was a pretty big fan of regulation in politics. He was hardly a free market fundamentalist. But this is a really important insight. The majority is almost always wrong, as we'll see tomorrow, when it comes to making choices about new products. Economics, we always choose at the margin. So let me leave you with this. We have 3 mechanisms. Markets use the profit test. Rent seekers use the rent or subsidy test. And they generally have to appeal to politics, which means that you're making decisions by the median voter, but the median voter is using other people's money. All of those systems are imperfect. And as we'll talk more about next time, sometimes we can get in trouble by relying on one or the other in the wrong circumstance. Thanks, and I'll see you Wednesday.